So I will now hand you over to Tom, who will be chairing Sowon Park's keynote, Dr. Sowon Park's keynote talk now, Memory Out of Bounds, and I will, let you take over.
Okay, yes, welcome back everyone to a bit that I've really been looking forward to. So yes, we've come to that point in the day where we have our first keynote of the conference for the next hour or so, and it's entitled Memory Out of Bounds by Dr. Sowon Park. And Sowon Park teaches at UC Santa Barbara, and she specializes in British modernism, world literature, and the relationship between literature and other forms of knowledge, in particular cognitive neuroscience. I've been really looking forward to this one in particular because of what it sets up for some of the talks tomorrow, particularly our final panel, where we have poetry and neuroscience, we have a discussion of people living with dementia. So really, I think this kind of kicks off a lot of the themes that we're going to be looking at over the next day. So yeah, just to not waste any time, I'm going to just hand over to Dr. Park and let you kick off.
I will have to share my screen, but before I do, I'd like to thank Alicia and Tom for inviting me. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you everyone for zooming in. It's really exciting to be talking to and sharing my work with people in Ireland. It's like, because I've just been here, for 2 years now. Thank you. So the boundary that I am going to be trying to examine today would be the boundaries set by scientific materialism, and another boundary that's formed by the humanist tradition with reference to the memory system. And it's not to flag up the last word or the definitive idea of what memory is, but just to go through a series of ideas on the human memory system, so that perhaps as a result, your ideas about what memory is might be changed as, because of the juxtaposition between the two. So now just before though, I'm very sorry to be joining in at the last minute because of the time zone issue, and I caught just the back end of I think it was Natalia and Robert's discussion on suffering, and I mean this is recorded, so I hope I will get to watch that's great, because I just wanted to say that I'm part of a specialization called Literature and Mind in the English department, and we've just begun a project on trauma-informed education, and it did seem like the papers would be very, very relevant. So I look forward to watching the recordings, and I may be in touch with you. So okay, I will share screen. So memory out of bounds is my topic, and when we think about memory, there are some standard ideas. And so memory is what we can remember as a recollection, retrieving of the past. So for example, things like what I remember from my childhood, some significant moments, or some very, very painful moments that I have actually gone through that I can retrieve and recall. So this would be a very standard definition of what memory is. And the particular importance that we attach to memory is because it provides us with a sense of personal continuity. It gives us a sense of identity, as well as other things. And so the relationship between memory and self, or self-experience, is very strong. Many people would go so far as to say memory is really who we are. So this is Louis Buñuel in his memoirs. He says, memory is what makes our lives. Life without memory is no life at all. So it attaches a very, very huge importance on what he can remember to the significance of what he is or what his life is. Continuing on this theme is Virginia Woolf, Sketch of the Past. Many of you will be very familiar with this. It's so beautiful. And she says, if life has a base that it stands upon, if it is a bowl that one fills and fills and fills, then my bowl, without a doubt, stands upon this memory. It is of lying half asleep, half awake, in bed, in the nursery at St. Ives. It is of hearing the waves breaking 1, 2, 1, 2, and sending a splash of water on the beach and then breaking 1, 2, 1, 2 behind the yellow blind. It is of hearing the blind draw its little acorn across the floor as the wind blew the blind out. It is of lying and hearing the splash and seeing this light and feeling it is almost impossible that I should be here, of feeling the purest ecstasy I can conceive. So this is from her memoir, Sketch of the Past. And again, the fact that Virginia Woolf can recall her childhood experience of hearing the waves 1, 2, is the base of her life, that the bowl that fills and fills and fills. So they're just like, there are so many examples of the relationship between memory and self, and these are just two. Now I am going to contrast this notion of what memory is today by looking at memory out of bounds, and that has to do, and I'll do this with reference to two patients, patient HM and patient EP. Some of you may or may not be familiar with these two patients, and the idea that the way we remember are multiple. It's the multiple ways in which we remember. Because what changed the traditional idea of memory, i.e. recollection, retrieval, was the beginning of this was in 1962, which really drastically changed this humanist conception of memory and self. So this was Brenda Milner's famous experiment. Brenda Milner works at the Montreal Neurological Institute, and she was one of the first people to work on the amnesic patient HM. So this is HM, Henry Gustav Mollison, and he became amnesic in 1953 when he was 27 years old, because he had been getting increasingly severe epilepsy, which completely paralyzed him. And of course, his neurons are destroyed every time he had an attack. So he had part of his brain that was prone to epilepsy taken out. That was the operation. 1953, when people used to do such things. He was 27 years old, and for the next 55 years, nearly 100 neuroscientists studied him. First by Brenda Milner at Montreal Neurological Institute, and then since 1966 by neuroscientist Sue Corkin at MIT, and she studied HM for 46 years. So this is the operation that he had. So he had bilateral medial temporal lobe resection, bilateral in both sides of the brain, medial temporal lobe, like the inner bit of the brain, not the top, not the back, not the front, but the inner part, where you have the hippocampus and the amygdala. And so the front part of the hippocampus on both sides were removed. Most of the amygdala were removed, and the hippocampal gyrus. So at this point, it was not clear what these parts of the brain were responsible for, hence with the audacity with which they removed them. But afterwards, after the surgery, HM lost his capacity to remember. So he couldn't store memories, so he had anterograde amnesia, and he couldn't retrieve memories, so he had retrograde amnesia. He had some kind of very, very early memories, but most of it was completely destroyed. So there was now a very strong correlation between the medial temporal lobe and memory. So because he couldn't remember after that particular bit was removed. But what Milner did really reset knowledge about how human memory system works, because HM was regarded as a complete amnesia, i.e. he was living a life without memory. He had no bowl that fills and fills and fills, and yet he seemed to have a fairly normal life. So Brenda Milner taught HM to trace between the two outlines of the shape of a star while looking at his hand in the mirror, which is quite tricky to do. If you try it at home, it is like, you know, even people with functioning memory system is quite hard, but so you have to do it without going over the line. And this is what HM did. So that's kind of the test. And so the first time you go over many times, this is the first day, he went over 30 times. By the 10th attempt, there was some learning. There was some learning of the shape of the stars. And so he got it down under 10 at the end of the day. He came back the second day. Of course, he couldn't remember he had done this before. He couldn't remember Brenda Milner. He couldn't remember anything, but he did it. The first attempt was like, I think it was 12. So somewhere in his system, there was some recollection that this had been done before and that his performance improved. And by the third day, you can see that he is as good as a normal subject. Now, the significance of his improvement, his performance, was not considered to be a form of memory because it was just a skill. So the fact that some part of HM could remember that he had done this before and therefore he could do it better wasn't really slotted into how we understand memory. And it wasn't really understood for the next 20 years. Brenda Milner's study really took a very, very long time to get acknowledged because skilled movements, again, didn't really get integrated. But what happened gradually was that there was a growing consensus that the brain has multiple memory systems. Part of it may be conscious, part of it may be unconscious, that you can remember things without knowing that you remember, and that the two of them work in parallel and in combination. And so the Virginia Woolf and Buñuel kind of memory is just one part of the human memory system. So the significance of and so for the next 55 years, he went through so many tests, and the significance of what HM could and couldn't do leads us to think about very interesting questions. So first of all is, where is memory stored in the brain? Obviously, there are other parts of the brain that's storing the memory because HM could still recollect, you know, albeit that he didn't know that he could recollect. It also redefines what memory is, what it means. And finally, I think most relevant for this conversation is that it reshapes how we understand human agency. Because if you think that human agency comes from your sense of self, if you have no sense of self, but still can exercise a greater degree of human agency, then it really has to reshape how we understand it. So I'll move on to my next example is patient EP. So this is Larry Squire at UCSD, who studied another famous patient called EP, Eugene Pauly, for 14 years. Eugene Pauly contracted viral encephalitis at the age of 70, very, very high temperature. And when he came to, he couldn't remember. He became an amnesiac. And again, he couldn't store memories, so he had anterograde amnesia, and he couldn't retrieve memories. He had retrograde amnesia, but his personality, cognitive functions, language skills remained more or less intact. So we are now going to watch EP in action with the Squire Lab people, and this is, you know, they've been coming to him once a month, you know, and Eugene had met them at least 150 times by this point. He still doesn't remember that he's seen them before, but we'll see how he approaches the tests. Thank you, Alicia.
With a man whose own ability to create memories vanished almost entirely a decade ago, Ever since, he's been helping researchers from the University of California, San Diego.
Hey, good to see you, by God.
Today, Larry Squire and Jen Frascino are on the latest of many visits the team has made to the man known to memory researchers everywhere as EP.
Oh, it's wonderful. Got a nice sun for the camera.
Yeah.
A little work?
We're going to go in, you're going to do some work with Jen.
EP is now 82.
This is fun. Enjoyable.
In 1992, retired from a career in electronics, he suffered an acute virus infection that destroyed part of his brain.
Research and development, that's what I like.
Most of his thinking skills survived the damage virtually intact.
Why should people pay taxes?
To support your country and your counties and states to pay for things.
If you were lost in the forest during the day, how would you go about finding your way out?
I would find a river and follow the river down to wherever it may go. Ocean, lake.
EP can also copy complex drawings.
About it, huh?
And he not only has no difficulty repeating back a list of words, in this case, dog, raccoon, lion, and parrot,
Dog, raccoon, lion, and a parrot.
Good.
but he even has a little sly fun with Jen along the way.
What you gotta add is about 2 more.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Would that make it tougher?
Then that would catch them. Maybe 7, you know. Leaf. Medicine.
EP really hits his stride when the testing of his cognitive skills involves Jen's laptop computer.
Gold. Having been in electronics over the years, I am amazed at all this. It's just wonderful. Believe me, little printed circuits, just, oh, you can't believe it. It used to be in a 6-foot rack, and down to this, it's just wonderful. When I was in electronics, this would be in a 6-foot rack.
But it's now that something odd about EP's behavior becomes apparent.
Printed circuits, diodes, triodes, and all that stuff in there. Oh, it's just amazing, believe me. When I was in electronics, this would be in a 6-foot rack. This would be in a 6-foot rack. It would be in a couple 6-foot racks. It would be in 6-foot racks. This would be in a 6-foot rack. And now look at it, down to this. Little printed circuits and...
So he's not aware that he's told us 3 or 4 times that he used to be in electronics, that a computer used to fill a room, and that now it's down to the size of a microchip. He's just not aware that he said those things several times.
No, he tells us the same stories again and again. We've heard these stories before, and we'll hear these stories again.
The equipment that it takes.
How was it? How have you been? You've been enjoying this session?
I enjoy this.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It is interesting, isn't it?
Look at the work you guys are doing. You're getting wonderful, I believe.
I'm sorry, I forget her name. What's her name?
Her name?
Yeah.
I don't remember.
Okay, Jennifer.
Jennifer.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Have you met Jennifer before today?
I think so, yes. I'm not positive, though.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Mom.
No.
Oh, that's
It's
okay.
okay.
Yeah.
We all have.
Well, we all get that one.
Oh, sure.
How much have you worked with him?
We have probably visited his house 200 times.
200 times. And for him, is each time the first time for him?
Well, you see, it's yes and no. It's clear that he does have a record of the experiences that are based on the habits, the interactions, the emotional values of the interactions, the fact that they've been positive and not negative. He certainly lets us in the door faster.
I mean, like you saw, he couldn't tell you my name.
Yeah.
He couldn't tell you if you saw me before. But there's definitely a rapport there that I think has been built, and he's aware on some level.
I read you some words about 15 minutes ago. 4 of them. 4 words. Do you remember me reading you 4 words?
No, I can't
No?
recall. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Don't need to
My
apologize.
mind is getting old.
That's okay. I read you 4 animals, and I want you to tell me yes if you think the animal was on the list I read you about 15 minutes ago, or no if it was not on the list.
Wonderful.
Okay? Cat.
Yes.
How sure are you?
I feel reasonably sure
Reasonably
on that cat.
sure? Uh-huh. Raccoon.
No, I feel no.
Giraffe.
Yes.
How sure are you that I wrote
I'm
you that
real
book?
sure on that.
Real sure?
They're beautiful animals,
Okay.
believe me.
Lion.
No.
Okay.
EP's inability to
Okay, so I will share screen again. So the work that Larry Squire's lab did led to the discovery of what we call the long-term memory system. And they worked on comparative lesion studies as well as human studies. So they worked on monkeys, rats, and humans in the 1990s, which really led to the rediscovery of Brenda Milner's work. And so this is the landmark paper in 1996, the Taxonomy of the Human Memory System, or the Mammalian Memory System, which is in every textbook now. And that is, before I'll go back to the taxonomy, and here Larry Squire and Eric Kandel, this is from a different book. Eric Kandel won the Nobel Prize for his work on the memory system, and they write that memory is not a single entity, but composed of different systems. Only one of these systems is accessible to awareness, the declarative memory system. So Virginia Woolf's sketch of the past and other kinds of memory that we normally associate is just one kind of the memory system. And you can see that there are lots of different kinds according to biology. So this is not working memory, it's long-term memory. So you could see that EP has a functioning working memory, but it's just long-term memory that does not get stored or retrieved. So the declarative explicit memory system for facts and events would be stored in the medial temporal lobe and the diencephalon, which is the bit that that affected EP's brain and HM's brain. And so once you lose that part of the brain, then the capacity to recall facts and events will be lost to you. But that's just the declarative system, the explicit system. So it would be like facts. So, you know, we have something called infantile amnesia. So we are not able to remember, or at least most people are not able to remember what happened to us between, say, birth and roughly 2 or 3 years old. But that's just declarative memory. What happened to us in the womb and up to 3 years will provide a foundation for the rest of our lives in terms of the non-declarative memory system. The fact that we cannot recall what happened to us as an infant does not mean that we don't have traces of it. We have enormous imprints of that particular memory. So for instance, if you are as a 2-year-old, you're knocked down by a very large dog, you won't be able to remember the event because of infantile amnesia, but you may, as a grown-up, have a fear of dogs, or you will have a sensation of discomfort when you're near dogs, and then you will understand this as part of your personality. You'll just think, oh, I'm not really into dogs, or I don't really like dogs, or you know, or you may not even register, but you will feel a little bit uncomfortable when you're around dogs. So that's because it's stored in the non-declarative, implicit or procedural memory system, of which there are at least 4 different kinds with very specific neuroanatomical structures that underlie and support these systems. So to be procedural memory, priming, what's called priming, conditioning, and non-associative learning. And I'll just go through a few examples. We all have something called a spatial memory. Even for people like me, I never know where I am, but even I will have some kind of an instinct to think, oh, maybe I should have gone this way or that way when you're trying to go back home, for example, because there are specific neuroanatomical structures with place cells, grid cells, which represent the external world in the brain without you being aware that it's being done. So it's done with before you know it. It's sometimes called our inner GPS system. John O'Keefe and the Moses won the Nobel Prize for this work in 2014. Other kinds of non-declarative memory would be skills and habits. So this would be HM and the 2 stars, but lots of other things like what we call muscle memory would be the most representative non-declarative memory system. So it'd be swimming, cycling, skiing, perfecting the tennis stroke, or doing a pirouette. All these things that at the point you perform these things, you're not really thinking, I have to do this. You're doing it without thinking, and yet your brain can do it, or you can do it. In fact, when you're working on the non-declarative memory system, trying to use the conscious memory system, the declarative memory system, will worsen your performance because it will try to override the other. In performance, it's much better to let the non-declarative memory system work in full flow without one trying to override the other. It'll be playing musical instruments, but it's also reading and writing. Learning how to read is a skill, and it's striatum related. And once you acquire the ability how to recognize various patterns as words, you can't unknow it because non-declarative memory is much more stable than declarative memory. And so once you have it, it's very, very robust until I mean, with dementia, until the very end. It's the last thing to go because it's spread all over the neocortex. It isn't just contained in one area. Writing is another kind of non-declarative memory because we can all write without knowing how we do it. If you really think about how we do it, I think that's quite paralyzing. So recognition, including rhythm, repetition, flow, these are all non-declarative memory that we have accumulated, and a lot of writers and poets will exploit this. They'll be aware of this, and they will build up a pattern and deviate from the pattern, and they will train the reader to expect the repetition and the flow, and then create effects. So this is working on kind of the non-declarative memory system. More importantly, more interestingly for me anyway, would be the habits, the emotional habits that we acquire, because we don't often think of emotion as a memory, or very rarely anyway, but there are habits of loving, habits of hating, aversion, craving, addiction, and emotions, all kinds of emotions surrounding anticipation, such as surprise, pleasure, longing. These are all undergirded by non-declarative memory system, which is functioning all the time without our knowledge. So, for example, T.S. Eliot's poetics, fascinating poetics, may appear a little bit cryptic, but for example, in the Music of Poetry, he says, I have never been able to retain the names of feet and meters, or to pay the proper respect to the accepted rules of scansion. The only way to learn to manipulate any kind of English verse seemed to be by assimilation and imitation, by becoming so engrossed in the work of a particular poet that one could produce a recognizable derivative. So here I think that he is saying that the way you learn to write poetry is through conscious effort, but you've got to be so immersed in it that you are steeped in the non-declarative memory of the patterns and the rhythms of a particular poet, that when you begin to write, your writing would be supported by the conscious memory system and the unconscious memory system. And I think that when we write or when we do anything, we always have a sense that, oh, that's right, or that doesn't feel quite right, which could be interpreted through non-declarative memory. And there are aesthetic non-declarative memory symbols or structures or theses, if you like. So T.S. Eliot's objective correlative, Virginia Woolf's idea of moments of being, Clive Bell's idea of significant form, or James Joyce's idea of the epiphany, could all be reinterpreted in the light of the biological mechanism of the non-declarative memory system. And of course, we can't talk about memory, without referring to Freud, non-declarative memory has a great parallel with what used to be regarded as the unconscious in the history of psychoanalysis. And again, Freud didn't think of the unconscious with reference to memory. And so if we look at like the iceberg model, the unconscious and the conscious, you know, the tip of the iceberg, you have thoughts and perceptions, in the unconscious that you have no direct awareness of, but it kind of overrides you. And then he said that memories would be stored in what he calls the pre-conscious. But in the light of neuroscience, we could think of memory as really providing a bound of the unconscious experiences as well as the conscious experiences. It stretches above and below. So, for example, again, it's Squire and Candell. They write, people do not generally remember consciously the circumstances in which they acquire and assimilate the moral principles that govern their lives. Many of our dispositions and styles that make up our personality are acquired similarly as non-declarative knowledge. These principles and dispositions are acquired gradually and almost automatically, like the rules of grammar that govern our native language. So what neuroscientific knowledge flags up or opens or redraws is the idea that even our ethical, moral selves might be a form of memory that we don't actually know that we have. We don't know that we are carrying around us. And they continue, these various forms of non-declarative memory are ancient in evolutionary terms. They are reliable and consistent, and they provide for myriad unconscious ways of responding to the world, in no small part by virtue of the unconscious state of these forms of memory. They create much of the mystery of the human experience. Here arise the dispositions, habits, and preferences that are inaccessible to conscious recollection, but nevertheless are shaped by past events, influence our behavior and mental life, and are an important part of who we are. And so HM and EP have taught us a great deal about the cognitive and neural organization of memory. And they kind of sketch for us new boundaries in terms of not only of how we remember, but who we think we are. So if all the recollections that we don't know that we have are influencing our sense of self, our habits, our dispositions, the way we react to the world, is it right in thinking that, like Buñuel, that we are what we remember? It doesn't seem like it. It seems a lot more complicated than that. And it poses another question. If we remember a ton of things that we don't know that we remember, what else can we do without being aware of it? So there are many, many processes that go on in the brain that's beyond our awareness. In fact, according to scientific models of the relations between brain and mind, most of what we do happen outside of our awareness. What we see, what we remember, how we react to the world, our preferences, our fears, it would appear that they happen without our knowledge, and what we experience is a kind of a justification or narrativization of what already happened without knowing that it happened, which leads to the idea of the automaticity of our being. So you'll remember just in the clip EP, when he sees the computer, the external stimulus, the visual perception of the computer prompts something in his brain, which triggers his awareness that when I was in engineering, you know, it was in a sixth. And then he forgets that he said that, and he looks at it again, it triggers the same thing. It's almost automatic. The external stimulus triggers a bubble of thoughts, which is automatic, beyond his control, although he will experience that as something that he thought, and he has some kind of agency over, like we all do. So if life is lived automatically like this, should we conclude then that humans are merely biological machines, that the machinery, the biological machinery of who we are, really govern our lives? Now, this comes up against another faith held equally strong in today's world. So you've got the scientific materialist kind of naturalist view of humans as machines, humans as biological machines. And the other view that because we are humans, somehow we can exercise choice over our animal machinery and transcend it. Because we are humans, we are exceptional, and we will engineer ourselves so that we don't have to be limited by biology. So these two views of the human are held equally strong in today's world, I think. So I would like to end with a few questions. I mean, the first question is kind of the conflict between the materialist view of who we are and the humanist view of that we do have some freedom, some choice from our biology. And other questions are, well, what are the dispositions and styles that make up your personality? If, you know, that would be a very, very interesting discussion to have, I think, for me. And how are they acquired as non-declarative knowledge? I mean, here you can only guess, because of course, when we acquire non-declarative knowledge, we are not aware that we are acquiring them at the time, especially as an infant. So for example, in my case, I used to be very, very sensitive to noise. Like any loud noise I would get disproportionately frightened. So any scary films or any, like even in a cinema, if the noise is too loud, I would find it too painful. And I always thought that, oh, it's just like my personality, I just don't know. But now I feel like I must have experienced something that left a traumatic memory in my brain, that I am oversensitive to noise. And now that I have this knowledge that I am oversensitive to noise, somehow it's not so frightening. And so there is a way that I think knowledge itself can free you from certain things. I also know that I have a very, very poor wear pathways, i.e., you know, the spatial grid, like, you know, where the brain, I have a very, and now that I know this, consciously, I can kind of plot so that I have all kinds of tricks so that I can remember, because my non-declarative memory system is not functioning very well. So that knowledge that you can, as humans, override your limitations to a certain extent. But what's even more interesting is if you think about your friends and family and people that you love, and you think about them not as not as being fully conscious of what they do at all times, but they too have their dispositions and habits and preferences that they can't access. But from the outside, that is actually easier to see, because other people's patterns of emotions is much easier to see than your own. And once you are able to see that, it's a lot easier to be compassionate and understanding, because you're not thinking, that person is intentionally trying to harm me. You know, it puts the picture in a more complex way, I think, which returns us to a more humane model of how we interact with others. So these are the questions that I would like to flag up, and I hope that we can have a discussion about, maybe I went too fast, about the kind of memory systems that I've put before you, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. And so this is part of the unconscious memory project that I'm doing here at UCSB. We have a website and we're doing lots of very interesting things. And if you're interested in any part of the unconscious memory system, or the interface of neuroscience and the humanities, what we call the neurohumanities, then please do get in touch. We would love to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sowon, for that brilliant talk. It's really, I knew there would be lots of questions anyway going through the content, but then to finish on questions will really guarantee that there'll be questions and comments to your own questions. But also just really such a privilege, you know, when we try and design kind of an interdisciplinary conference that touches on lots of disciplines throughout it, to have one talk that does that on its own is really, really nice. So I can see already that there is a question in the chat box that's from Natalia. So thank you for these very illuminating insights into non-declarative memory mechanisms. I wonder, what are the implications for dealing with psychological trauma? And is there a way to overwrite the unconscious traumatic code epigenetically?
Yeah, thank you, Natalia. That's very, very close to my heart, because as I mentioned at the beginning, we've just begun a project on trauma-informed classroom or trauma-informed pedagogy, because unconscious memory, the most, I think, important area that we've got to look at is the area of trauma. And again, the commonsensical view of trauma is something that you can remember it, you know what happened, but there are a wide variety of traumas which are accumulative. It can be developmental, it can be non-declarative. And so how do you deal with trauma if you don't actually know how you got it, or if you got it, when you got it? I don't know whether you know Peter Levine's work or Gabor Mate's work, The Wisdom of Trauma. The most effective way of dealing with trauma, I mean, there are many, many ways, but the first port of call has to do with your body, your somatic experiences. So by acknowledging that certain things are in fact triggering, I know that's a term that a lot of people don't necessarily like. If you find yourself reacting to something in your body, and there are all kinds of techniques to identify how your nervous system is dysregulated. Once you identify that you are dysregulated, then there are lots of techniques to bring yourself to the bounds of safety, what they call like your safety zone, and so that you have a window of tolerance upon which you can then begin to consciously understand and unravel. But if one tries to go at the deep end fast and talk about trauma, that is often very, very re-traumatizing. It doesn't necessarily help. And I think this is why the teaching of literature can often be so difficult. And this is why we have like trigger warnings, which they don't really do much. Because it's not really recognizing the suffering that people have gone through, and it's actually the witnessing of the suffering and the pain as a community. That's the first step to healing. Trigger warnings, go to therapy. Of course, therapy helps. Of course, trigger warnings do help, but they in themselves don't really do anything holistically. And I think to teach literature, first of all, we've got to, I think, acknowledge who the students are, you know, what their traumas are. It can be racial trauma, it can be gender-based violence trauma, it can be climate trauma, it can be developmental trauma, but just the recognition that as humans, we have non-declarative memories which are affecting the way we are, affecting the way we respond to the world, and there are ways of overcoming it humanely. I think is a great step forward. I think. I don't know, Natalia, if what your thoughts are.
Thank you very much. That was brilliant, and that also coincides with my interests currently, because after the pandemic, I increasingly noticed that my students, I especially teach students from the post-Soviet space where they have problems with the totalitarian regimes. They are traumatized by their high school education, very highly by the influence of propaganda, and they have fears and traumas that I did not expect 19-year-olds to have. And no matter what I'm teaching, whether it is philosophy or literature, I have to be aware of that. And that's why it's very much of my concern at this moment, this topic. Thank you very much for this illuminating explanation.
Well, thank you, Natalia, for sharing that with me. It's so interesting to learn that this is happening in other classrooms too. It's only really through teaching here. I thought when I first came here, this is California, you're all like sunny and surfing and like everybody's so happy. And I was staggered by the level of fear that's in my students. I mean, you know, I think partly it's because of the digital internet generation. So they've grown up with this kind of fear of being unliked or disliked or cancelled or whatever. And I actually do think that young people now, they have a higher level of stress than I did when I was that age because of the pressures of technology and the internet. And something has got to give, I think. So thank you, Natalia.
Okay, we also have a question by Moon Young, which is in the chat box. So thank you so much for the fascinating talk. When we were studying Proust and Beckett, we discussed the idea of involuntary memory, how certain triggers in life, smell of Madeleine, can transport you to a past that you were unaware of and without your control. I was wondering how that might tie in with non-declarative memory, or is this a completely separate concept?
No, it's not a completely separate concept. So in the humanities, in philosophy in particular, especially Gilbert Ryle, a lot of people did notice, especially Proust and Habit, that you know, your preferences or involuntary memory, Gilbert Ryle's knowing how and knowing that. So there are lots and lots of distinctions. But now with empirical biological anatomical work, they're all pulled together into an umbrella and organized, so they fit in, not perfectly, but aspects of it fit in. And of course, the memory system, like everything about the brain, they work in parallel and in combination. So if you just observe behavior, it's incredibly difficult to figure out what's happening because they work together. So it's only with patients like EP and HM who lack certain parts of the brain that we can have a more precise understanding of the various system and how one overrides the other, or they work in parallel. And there was a brief conversation about creativity earlier, which I caught. And one of the really great things about creativity from a neuroscientific perspective is and there's some fairly strong evidence to suggest this, it's when the unconscious system and the conscious system are working together that you have the highest burst of creativity. When one is trying to suppress the other, which often happens, it often does not lead to anything remotely like a flow, as we would call it. So that the idea that the brain is like a society, has lots and lots and lots of different neural networks, and sometimes they collaborate, which results in what we would experience as creativity, I think is such a happy, optimistic model of not just the brain, but of how we can be as humans. Thank you, Moon Young. That sounds like a Korean name, am I right? Well, I think so, because I'm Korean, so okay.
I can offer to unmute Moon Young here, but while we're waiting, I can see Connor's raised his hand, so I think if you're happy to go ahead, I could just let you take the floor.
Hi, yes, thank you so much, Dr. Park, for a really, really fascinating talk. I'm sorry for not putting my question in the chat. I just have a feeling that it's going to get long-winded. I'll try not to let it, but I loved the literary examples that you gave of epiphany, how you tied that in with these two memory systems. And just because you finished on this question of whether we're biological machines, our kind of go-to text in German studies for that is called On the Marionette Theater by Heinrich von Kleist. I don't know if you've...
I don't know very well, but yeah.
Okay, yeah, and just there the idea is this kind of, this idea of dancing having a natural grace that's kind of innocent before it's been reflected upon, before it's been learned, but then is lost the minute the dancer becomes aware of their own kind of movements and has to be relearned. Like it has to be, you have to find your way back to it through learning the skill all over again. And I'm not sure that I can quite square this circle for myself and for you here, but I'm just wondering whether that fits in at all with that kind of idea of, I'm wondering whether the example that you give of infantile amnesia, this non-declarative memory, whether there's a way of accessing it consciously and maybe reworking it, or is it sort of fixed for life? Is it kind of a fake? And I am sorry that it was rambling on.
No, that is such an interesting question, and like $1 million question, I think, because if we had the technology to do that, and it's not impossible, you know, optogenetics, that just technologically, we're going through like an exponential like curve. So let's say that we get to the stage where we can monitor our neural processes, and with big data, we can really very precisely identify the kind of reactions we have to a large range of things. I know it sounds like science fiction, but you know, I think it's not impossible. Then that knowledge will liberate, because then the nervous system, after all, it can only be strengthened and weakened. There are only two ways it works. You either strengthen it or you weaken it. And so you can, if you know that this is a problematic area for you, then you can do all kinds of exercises to weaken that synapses so that you don't get re-triggered. But that knowledge is, of course, very, very complicated. But there are easier ways to do this. I mean, the long tradition of meditation is precisely that, becoming aware of your sensations. And once you become aware of the difficult sensations, then you put all your energy in calming that sensation down before you consciously address the social system which created this in you. And I think that is that is a way of being kinder to yourself and others, because sometimes, like if one has experienced great injustice, and of course throughout history, millions and millions of people have, retribution or even justice does not automatically get rid of the suffering, because the suffering continues. It can help, but they're kind of separate. So I think addressing the trauma or the memory, good and bad, in yourself is the first step to gaining some control over them. Thank you, Connor. I'll have to look up the Kleist essay, which I've been meaning to.
And oh yeah, I can see Katrina has a hand up. If I could unmute you.
Thank you very much for really stimulating a stimulating talk, and I was actually going to ask you about Kleist as well. So, but maybe kind of following on that, within Kleist, there's the kind of domain of knowledge that we find ourselves in, where we have two forms of memory in your terms, or in Kleist's terms, two forms of knowledge, kind of spontaneous natural knowledge and then conscious knowledge clashing with one another. within that space of knowledge, it's kind of temporal. So there's a before, a sort of a paradise of innocence, and then there's an after, which would be something like total knowledge, another form of paradise. But the aesthetic is caught along with us in that temporal zone between one paradise and another. And I'm wondering about the role of language in modernism in the light of that. So to what extent you're looking at modernist texts that are not accidentally very concerned with the capacity of language to remold itself in a way that might stretch it further, in one way might expand itself, break all its own boundaries, break its rules so that it could say everything and not just some things anymore. But on the other hand, a language that would shrink itself away in other forms of the avant-garde to sort of disappear into a silence that you might say are like the paradise before and the paradise after. So if you could maybe say a little bit about those modernist key terms, the epiphany, the objective correlative in terms of language, and how that reflects this sort of wrestling of the declarative and the non-declarative. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Julia. That's such a fascinating, huge question. And so the first thing I will say, I think, which is relevant, is the consolidation of the memory system. So every time we remember, we retrieve something from the past, and then it's reconsolidated and stored. So every time we remember, it's really, really easy for the memory to be recast and then consolidated with that kind of recasting. So human memory is extremely, extremely unreliable. And there's a saying, you know, one is lying like an eyewitness, because people will say, I saw it with my own eyes, but because of the fallibility of the human memory system, because it gets reconsolidated, that it's very, very reliable. Even, you know, I've noticed this myself many, many times. I could have sworn that it was red, and then it's actually blue. What could have happened? And so here, because the brain is always trying to extract the gist and consolidating the gist, it can be it can kind of sprawl in many directions according to the state of the person who's doing the recalling. So if one is depressed, you will remember the past from a perspective which may not be what actually happened, but it will be overcast by your present mood, which will then reconsolidate that. Or if you're happy, you will remember it much happier than you actually did at the time. So there's a lot of really interesting work on eyewitness testimony and criminal law. And then you can kind of see, wow, this is truly interesting. But with reference to language, language is such an organized, you know, it's such a classifier of knowledge and memory. Once you remember it through verbal categories, then it will be more robust. Now, the question is, was that the right categorization in the first place? So it's kind of 1984. If you're only given certain categories to think with, then it will really inflict great distortions on what actually happened. And because once it's consolidated into that category, you will experience it that way every time you remember. So I think language can be, like modernist language, is extremely freeing for that reason, because it makes it less fixed. But once you try to fix your experience into very limited categories, I think that's when life becomes reduced and manipulatable to certain kinds of ideological pressures. What do you think, Katrina?
I'm not quite sure what I'm not quite sure what I think. I mean, I guess I was thinking more from the aesthetic side of things and the centrality of imitation, and wondering whether sort of the kind of the constraints of mimesis that are being broken within modernism, whether they map on to this kind of memory framework as well, that there could be something like almost like a spontaneous recreation without memory.
Yeah, this might be slightly off, but there's not so much work done on modernist poetry. I mean, that would be very difficult but exciting to read about. But there's a lot of work done narrative and memory. And quite often people will narrativize the experience in a way that makes sense to them, in a way that feels comfortable to them, which will often have a consoling effect, but it won't be truthful. It's just a way of consoling yourself to the events, which may or may not be healthy. But this is just a personal opinion, with modernist language, I don't know whether this is true for everyone, but I think a lot of people feel an expansion of consciousness, and it will certainly trigger an experience in me that I can register, I can relate to, but it will kind of free up my mind. And I think that's the pleasure of reading modernist texts, that I can take myself to a place that is full of life and full of vitality than the way that I could remember with my own categories. Because I think narrating makes things narrow. It's this cause and effect, you know, whereas with modernism, because it's not so linear, and it works at the unconscious level, like, you know, T.S. Eliot, meaning is something you just throw to the guard dogs to do your own work, which should be surreptitious, i.e. it should be subliminal. I think in my personal experience, that's kind of the joys of modernist language, I think, because it provides a cognitive extension into the world that's not so fixed. But this is a long conversation, Katrina. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we can make the time for just one last question. I can see Robert has a hand up. I'm just going to ask you to unmute there. I think you'll be able to unmute yourself now.
I think that the question I had has been addressed in the last exchange. I'm thinking about back to Virginia Woolf's memory. That really, I don't think it was an acorn that was being dragged across the floor. I think it might have been the bottom of whatever was on the string that would open or close the shutters. And I don't think the waves were going, I'm number one, I'm number two. So somehow she is overlaying in this root memory. She seems to, if that's what it is, she seems to have overlaid some value, some need to present it that way, which being a writer, to me, itself would not be a closure. If that were a root memory to a writer, it's going to have to allow openness in the future. So somehow seeing the waves 1 and 2 and seeing an acorn makes it possible to create out of that. It begins with a creative moment, because those aren't the real things, right? The objective things, but it also permits a place to be, to sink a root so that you could create out of that.
Thank you, Robert, for the phrase root memory, which I love so much. Root memory, yeah, I quite agree. You know, the kind of pattern that she establishes through her unconscious memory, if you like, that you see in the waves, for example, that she's writing to a rhythm, not to a plot.
Right.
And the way that we as readers can respond to that is so beautiful. You know, you feel so connected through reading to another person's experience, which is felt. It's not just thought. Like, you can feel perhaps what she felt. That's how it feels anyway. Thank you, Robert. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for the conversation, which I enjoyed enormously. So you know, if anybody would like to be more involved in literature and the mind, or the trauma-informed project that we're doing, please do get in touch. Thank you, Alicia and Tom, for inviting me. And I will zoom in tomorrow, at least towards the end anyway.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Park. As expected, a talk of that caliber sparked such an interesting conversation, and we can see that from the reactions.